We have to put down the damn cell phones, have to stop this, and we have to recreate bonds.
You were the king, and now the very same guys, they look at you at a piece of dirt, let's say.
That's what Hegel said. History learns us that history learns us nothing, he said.
The preservation of our freedom is everyone's concern.
In this episode of Headwind, Jacobin Hausman and Alain Grutars have a roundtable discussion with Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Geert Vandenbosch. They are joined by our special guest, Dr. Matthias Desmet, clinical psychologist and specialist on mass formation psychosis.
As far as I know, they have been selling off some...
Look who's here.
Hey. Oh, Matthias. Wow. Nice to meet you again.
Yes.
Yeah, good to see you.
Yes. Robert, nice to finally meet you in the real world.
Yes.
Yeah.
So much. That's sincere.
Yes. So we have a few days now to talk here.
In the sunshine. In this lovely finca.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes. A nice place for intellectual.
Very good to meet you in person.
Yes.
It's been quite an interesting journey we're on.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I'm so glad to see the both of you meet as well, because your thoughts are very, very complementary. And
so yours as well, I guess. We are all on the same, same ship.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
All on the same ship is a good...
Yeah.
This metaphor of headwinds, I keep coming back, is really a ship metaphor, right? That we're sailing against the wind.
Yes.
Yeah, we have to tack periodically.
Which is always hard.
Yes.
And sometimes dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully we don't get blown onto the rocks.
But the thing is, we don't have the impression at all to be sailing against wind, right? Because we are sailing, in the right direction.
Absolutely.
So that feels strange to, when people think we are sailing against the wind.
Yeah, it's true. So I think that's, for me, that's why it can be at peace inside, is... I have, and hopefully it's not because I have my own counter mass formation, but I have a belief in myself that I have correctly interpreted the data, and I have faith in my ability to do that because I've succeeded in doing it before, and so that in the face of headwinds,
I think we all share that feeling.
Yeah,
and it's because we are really so convinced that we are doing the right thing and that it is based on really thorough analysis that we feel confident and have, despite all the harassment.
No matter
that
what the consequences.
Kind of like, peace in our minds.
If your reputation gets smeared and stuff like that, yes.
Yeah.
You need a good reason to continue to speak out.
Exactly.
That's what we should do, I think. We really should continue. Doing what we do.
That's what you teach us. We have no choice.
Yes, and yes, I try to do it myself, but I know how hard it is sometimes.
Yeah.
Yes. At the same time, it also makes me feel that I know now why I exist. Because
that is one thing, and the other thing is that you can still, as many times as you want, look in the mirror and look at yourself and say, I'm not sure. Others can do this, right?
Or maybe they can, I don't know, but...
Maybe they can, but...
Matthias, you exploded internationally the last few months, no? You've been on podcasts all over the world.
Thanks to Robert, I think.
Yeah.
No.
Yes, but that's true, yes. It all started with a podcast with Rainer Fulmich, if I remember well.
Yeah.
And then from there on, I slowly got a larger and larger international audience. And then Robert mentioned me at Joe Rogan's.
Yeah.
And he added the term to the term mass formation.
Yeah.
And that was very successful, I think. It made me famous around the world.
Or infamous.
Or infamous, yes.
The term that he added
I doubt it a little bit.
Yeah.
The term that he added was?
Psychosis. So I always use the term mass formation just referring actually simply to the formation of a mass or a crowd in a society. And then Robert added the term psychosis to it, which made it a little bit more sensational, I think,
edgy,
and made it spread around the world. But of course, at the same time, it may be added, from an ethical, pragmatic, and an intellectual point of view. It makes the term have a different meaning or a different connotation. It depends a little bit. But it was a very good move, I believe, to make the theory famous around the world, yes.
Well, it wasn't intentional.
Yes, I know.
It was a slip of the tongue.
No, actually it wasn't. I think that perhaps the way I can square the circle, one of the podcasters, and it was the one that I first encountered, that interviewed Matthias, used the term mass formation in the title, and then parens psychosis. So I inferred that this was the proper term.
Okay.
And then I began using it. It seemed appropriate. But Matthias has taught me, and I have been taught by the many detractors in the official media that this additional term, psychosis, has implications in terms of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for a psychiatric disease, and it's really not appropriate.
Yeah. Some scholars use the term mass psychosis, but I avoided it just in this crisis because everything is so sensitive.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that from a strategical point of view, it might be a better idea just to use a more neutral term, not referring to a psychiatric diagnosis, just to make people more comfortable with it, more at ease, and to accept maybe, or to be more open towards the theory behind it.
And to not rub them the wrong way, because that's kind of offensive, no? To say you have a disease or mental disease.
Yes, that is usually why I prefer the mass formation, yes. But even then, many fact checkers claim that the phenomenon does not exist, which of course is absurd, utterly absurd, because it has been studied for 200 years now, since the 19th century, first in a more conceptual way, and then in a more experimental way by people such as Ash and Sharif. So it's definitely a phenomenon that has been studied very thoroughly throughout the history of psychology.
Right.
Robert, why were you so struck by this theory? Why, when you encountered it?
So I've been constantly subjected to the why and the how questions. It always leads to that. This coordination, harmonization, resistance of individuals to data and information. And I think the world over, I speak to many different audiences from many different walks of life and geographically distributed. And those that are, I don't want to say woke, that's a term that has a lot of connotations, but have an awareness or resistance to this phenomena, have been perplexed by, particularly within families. I've heard this again and again, that these events have torn our family asunder. My well-educated sister or brother, I provide them this information and they're totally resistant to it. They can't hear it. They immediately reject me. They reject the information, then they reject me. And what's going on, this doesn't make any sense, has been a theme that I've just heard again and again and again. And then when I saw the interview, it just felt intrinsically right. It sometimes you encounter, at least for me, you encounter a scientific truth in where you've had this sense of incompleteness in current theoretical constructs. Why is this happening? It doesn't make any sense. The current models don't fit the data. And then somebody will present a new theory.
Matthias was your missing link.
And suddenly, a big part of the picture came into focus. Yeah. And I had there was a conceptual framework that made sense out of what was otherwise incomprehensible to me.
Yeah.
And so when I ran into this, I listened carefully. What are the phenomena? And I sought out all the podcasts I could get and I just hungered for understanding this better.
Geert, you also have been in the eye of the storm.
Really?
You got a lot of criticism, like your both your colleagues. How did you cope with that? How does it affect you personally?
I think what came up in me was essentially anger, not frustration or something like people thought, because from the very beginning I think I had done the proper homework, sufficiently thorough to come out and to speak out. So I knew from the very beginning that some details of what I was saying might have not entirely correct, but I was pretty much convinced that fundamentally I had a very, very strong point. And so that is one thing where this is based on many years of expertise in several different fields where you do a very in-depth homework. And then you see at the profile of this kind of people who are criticizing you, and then you say, okay, what kind of background do they have? And if some of them then tend to pretend that they do have some kind of background in this field, then you say, well, let's then have a discussion. And then you see that they refuse this discussion, and for me that's the end of the story. Well, what I then sometimes do, if I have time, because it's very time-consuming, is that I would nevertheless react to these comments, and in two ways. That I do it in a way that it's scientific, and that I make sure that they make fool of themselves, because it's a huge offense to the broader public, and that is what is basically bothering me so much, what is making me so angry. This intention, the intention to mislead people and to refuse any kind of scientific debate.
We've seen it always in history. Once a crowd becomes fanatically obsessed and fanatically convinced of a certain theory, a conviction, persuasion, a belief, they always start to become intolerant for other beliefs, and they start to aim their aggression and frustration at the dissonant voices. And that's quite... It makes sense, I believe, from a psychological point of view, just because this fanatic belief and this fanatic persuasion is a reaction or is a symptomatic solution for a kind of psychological discontent, a psychological frustration. And the dissonant voices always threaten to destroy the belief and to confront again with the initial discontent and the initial psychological suffering.
People like Robert and Geert are taking people out of their comfort zone, and that's very uncomfortable, of course. So that's why they're being attacked.
Yes, that's one of the reasons. At a psychological level, there are several reasons, but they are much harder to explain. But the most important reason definitely is that people start to fanatically believe to free themselves from a kind of a certain psychological dividedness, a kind of a psychological stress, and each dissonant voice threatens to confront them again with the initial psychological discontent.
But we thought we're in the 21st century. We had the Enlightenment, and it's like a big road going up to even more enlightenment. And then you see that even in academia, even at universities, these dissident voices are cancelled. This is, for me, this was incredible.
That's what Hegel said. History learns us that history learns us nothing, he said. And indeed, it repeats time and time again. And for some decades, we have, maybe for a few centuries, we have been under the illusion that we became more rational. We didn't become more rational, not at all. We believed that we became more rational.
Robert, you were saying this, the Ministry of Truth. You referred to that a lot, and that's from 1984. You even said that that's a real thing happening at the moment.
Right. So the Trusted News Initiative was set up originally by most of the Western countries to provide a structure to reduce what was perceived as the threat of foreign hostile interference in elections, in democratic elections, largely through social media and provision of alternative media. But there was this growing awareness that social media in particular could be weaponized and in a very methodical way. And certainly the Trump campaign showed how social media could be exploited in kind of a guerrilla way. That's part of what catapulted Trump to power and really blew through the traditional Republican Party firewalls. They thought there was no way that Trump would rise in the way that he did. And Mr. Pascal, who is a bit of a social media genius for whatever his limitations are, was able to actively exploit the algorithms and the tools of Facebook and others. And so there was this awareness that hostile foreign entities could do this. And so the Trusted News Initiative was established to tie together basically Western media and Western big tech, aligned with the interests of the Western democracies in terms of maintaining electoral integrity. And shortly thereafter, it was perceived as a structure as having value for the pharmaceutical industry, particularly for this thorny problem of the naysayers about vaccine safety and efficacy. In a general sense, this population of people that have been labeled as anti-vaxxers, for better or for worse. This is one of these gaslighting labels that is employed to marginalize individuals. If one can successfully apply this, then you have guilt by association with other things that have occurred in the past. And so then people are able to psychologically, I'm sure Matthias can say this much more eloquently, can psychologically process that this is an individual or this is a group or whatever that they shouldn't pay attention to because they are part of this out-group that is been disenfranchised in some way because of their belief system. And so pharma recognized that Trusted News represented a structure that could be used to counter some of the messaging that they found contrary to their interests. The British Broadcasting Corporation proudly announced that as the vaccine rollout was beginning, that they would take basically treaties or agreements that existed among the various media players and the governments and in tech and use these to counter what they believed was a threat of vaccine misinformation and disinformation. The differentiator in the term ostensibly is that disinformation is intentionally deployed to modify. So if we believed in the theory that the Russians intentionally intervened in the American election, we might call that disinformation. If they were intentionally spreading wrong information, non-factual information for purposes of some nefarious outcome, then that would be disinformation because intent. Misinformation being defined as information which is not consistent with some exterior norm that it's compared to, but it's the differentiator is that it's not intentionally promulgated for some nefarious purpose that's illegitimate. And so Trusted News was redirected towards eliminating the dissemination of this type of information, whether misinformation or disinformation, and largely anything that was defined as inconsistent with the official narrative as espoused by national health authorities or the World Health Organization. So that made it so that the definition of mis or disinformation was nationalized. It was stated, it was basically structured that if the National Health Service of the UK took a position, then within the confines of the UK information metasystem, anything that was said which was contrary to that would be deemed as mis or disinformation and should be silenced or edited or
sorry, and if that doesn't work, we just change the definition. That's
right. So then that has led.
Times.
So that's where we get really Orwellian. Is as you'll recall, one of the keys in much of Orwell's writing was the idea that language controls thought and controls behavior, and that words mean that which the state defines them to mean. If you dissect the redefinition in Webster's dictionary of an anti-vaxxer, which is a modern synthesis term, right, that's used as a pejorative, they changed the meaning to not only anyone who is espousing opinions contrary to vaccine effectiveness and safety. So if you don't believe vaccines are safe and effective, or a specific vaccine, then you're an anti-vaxxer. That's the pejorative.
Okay.
And then they redefined it that if you were not comfortable or against imposing mandates for vaccines, then you were also considered an anti-vaxxer.
Okay. Yeah.
And overlooking the amazing contradiction that the Nuremberg Accords make it very clear that unlicensed products shall not be mandated.
Yeah.
Right? There must be informed consent. This is fundamental to the bedrock of bioethics, modern bioethics. And yet, there it is in the dictionary. Basically, if you take the position of agreeing with the Nuremberg Accords, for which we hung people, right? We're talking about Mengele. But if you are against the ethics of Mengele, essentially, if you take this to a absurd endpoint, then you are by definition an anti-vaxxer in the context of vaccines. But what I found most tragic was these self-assembling groups of individuals reporting their adverse events. You know, I have been vaccine injured. I've experienced this. Okay, so if you think about it, these people are already rejected from society. They're already marginalized. They're reporting against the headwinds of this pressure from society. No, these are safe and effective, and you couldn't possibly have had this experience. Okay, so it is the most profound form of gaslighting, right? You have had a medical injury, and we don't believe you. And furthermore, if you report it on Facebook, we will delete that post. And if you create a user group where others like you come together and share their experiences with each other. I mean, Matthias's core theory is that we've all been socially fragmented. And all we're left with is these electronic ghosts of society, right? Essentially. So we're left with these ghosts of society, and people come together to form a group, to form a mass around their experience, for which they have been censored and excluded from society often. And they're sharing these common experiences, and then Facebook comes in and deletes that group. Okay, so now if you think about it, talk about gaslighting. These people, and I became really sensitive to it after I did the Brett Weinstein podcast. I got all these phone calls from distraught patients that had these experiences and were being told they couldn't possibly have had those experiences. And they were, the level of anguish was overwhelming. I mean, people crying, calling and crying. You know, I've had this and I'm rejected. My family doesn't believe me.
It reminds me, Matthias, of the Soviet Union, what happened there in the 60s, even the 50s, 60s, 70s, where every opposition was cancelled by saying you're crazy.
It happened even earlier, I believe, in the Soviet Union. Around 1930, the opposition was completely silenced in public space. And then the absurd atrocities started. That's so typical. It happens time and time again. Once there is no opposition anymore in public space, then the atrocity starts. Then the crowd typically starts to commit its atrocities. But Stalin pursued all this in an extremely intentional way. And that was not the same in Nazi Germany, actually. It was much less intentional in Nazi Germany. But Stalin really wrote this article himself about how you could control people's mind and body through language. Because in his ideal state, people would react as the dog of Pavlov to each word the state pronounced, to each word Stalin pronounced. He wrote this article about this. So Stalin was extremely aware of what he did, much more than the Nazis were. The process was different in Nazi Germany compared to the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, first the elite arose. First, the communist elite was formed, and then the mass formation emerged. And in the Nazi Germany, it was the other way around.
What we see now is the fact-checking. Geert, you experienced this in Belgium, because I know you got a bit angry about it. How do you experience this?
I don't identify myself with that society. I think I work in several different countries. I speak a number of languages. I'm not bound to this, ludicrous regional game that these people are playing. Mm-hmm. I can tell you, when I was working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I came to Belgium. Then these guys, these even professors, they were queuing up, to come into the room where I was presenting the kind of projects we were interested in, and etc. And you were like, this was like red carpet treatment. You were the king, and now the very same guys, all of a sudden, they look at you at a piece of dirt, let's say. Mm-hmm. So, this is just so poor mentality. I'm pretty extreme in my opinions. When you do this, you cannot afford just to let it go, because you need to come back with arguments. And most of the time, when I come back with these arguments, they get silenced. I don't hear back from them, right? Yeah. And if it's still not enough, then you challenge them and you say to them again, come on, let's have a debate, but I'm not into this face-to-face debates. Mm-hmm. I think what we need is really a multidisciplinary debate. We have been saying this a number of times. This is a multidisciplinary event, what's going on. And there's always one or the other, fancy guy who thinks, there's a lot of sensation when he or she can engage into a debate with one single person. There's one thing we should not forget. I'm always thinking, whatever we do, we need to try to add value to the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And when it becomes very, very personal, like some of these guys, even professors, they seem to be very excited about all this Twitter nonsense, mm-hmm. right? Where they are basically humiliating people. It's just unbelievable. That does not add any value.
I've been following you, Geert, and sometimes you really get angry. And Robert, I've seen you getting emotional sometimes. It's hard not to let this get under your skin, constantly being criticized with wrong arguments.
So I've had the benefit of mentors through this that have a lot more experience in media and this kind of media warfare than I do. And I've made some mistakes. The recent court case against Facebook regarding claiming that someone had been propagating false claims on the basis of the fact checkers revealed the Facebook lawyer's position that these aren't in fact checkers. These aren't facts. They're labeled as fact checkers, so they've used language, say this is a fact checker and this is what they do, they check facts. But in fact what they do, as Facebook's lawyers admit, is they reinforce opinions. They're not about facts. They are labeled as fact checkers, but they're not actually performing fact checking. What they're performing is reinforcing your opinions or an approved narrative. And the difference, I think, what I'm hearing from what you've experienced in your environment where you're being hit by academics is I'm constantly under pressure from an ecosystem in which Facebook has financially outsourced the fact checking, I think because of liability, to a company in the UK that has no credibility. It's headed up by someone from the Middle East with no background in science, and they've hired people with no background in science. And their job is to attack anyone who is presenting information that's inconsistent with the approved narrative as promoted by Facebook, largely, Mark Zuckerberg. And Mark Zuckerberg, for whatever reason, I have no idea, feels like he is very invested in the thesis that these vaccines are perfectly safe and effective. And he feels the need to actively reinforce this. And of course, he has enormous financial resources to do so. So there's a very different ecosystem because, to give you an example, Peter Navarro and I wrote an article in the Washington Times, an op-ed, in which we basically took the Great Barrington Declaration. We said we should restrict vaccines and it was very much influenced by Gert. Okay, so we wrote an op-ed influenced by Great Barrington and by Dr. Van den Bossche, and I think we might have even explicitly said so, certainly in terms of GERD, the idea that this universal vaccination was going to drive the selection of escape mutants, and what we should do is restrict vaccine to those that most needed it, the high-risk individuals. We should provide early diagnostic tests widely to the population so they could do home testing, make early treatment available, and make available applications on your cell phones to combat the fear so that people could get a self-assessment of what their true risk was. So those were our 4 highly controversial points, which are immediately fact-checked by Facebook. And it was a shock to the Washington Times that the Washington Times, when it posted this article on Facebook, was deleted, told, and then the Washington Times suddenly confronted the fact that they were experiencing this same sort of yellow journalism and character assassination on the whole enterprise of the Washington Times, and they were shocked by this. Yeah. And so they asked me to write a retort. So I spent 2 days writing a formal retort to the various points that Facebook's fact-checkers, official fact-checkers, had listed, and sent it into the Washington Times. And the Washington Times was quite shocked that the Facebook fact-checkers basically told them to go pound sand. They didn't care what these arguments were. No. They weren't going to change anything because it's not about the facts.
It's not about the facts. You're talking about media warfare, but then it comes to the real world, and you're talking about ivermectin, and you have a story where you call it a witch hunt sometimes, what's happening to the people in the field, like your personal physician, right?
And so now we have this curious case of Meryl Nass in the United States, in which this is an elderly woman that's been practicing medicine her whole life, was at the forefront of exposing some of the things that happened around the anthrax vaccine utilization and the Gulf War and all of those events. So deep in knowledge of the biodefense world, practicing physician who's been administering ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And so she was complaints were filed against her at her medical board. She has now lost her license, and they're insisting that she go have a psychiatric evaluation because basically of her wrongthink. And it exactly parallels what Matthias says, and this is the risk with this kind of pilot case, and I've heard a similar in the UK, and also in Canada, that if he's right, and this is a symptom of this transition period, then we're likely to see an acceleration of this.
Yeah, how far can this go, Matthias?
Extremely far. History has shown it, actually, how extremely far it can lead. Stalin killed eventually 50% of his own loyal party members, who usually didn't go against the party lines. So it can go until the complete destruction of society as we know it now, and in particular the complete destruction of humanity, because that is what totalitarianism does. It destroys humanity. It destroys every space for a human being to be a human being. So it can go extremely far. The good news is that it always destroys itself in the end. That's, in a cynical way, the good news. But it can definitely go until the full-fledged totalitarian regime.
And if you compare it to, let's stick to Stalin, Russia, where are we now?
So first you have the emergence of totalitarian thinking, parallel with the emergence of the phenomenon of mass formation. And then slowly a new regime or a new elite emerges from this process of mass formation. But actually at this moment, to be honest, since the corona crisis, we can doubt whether we do live in a democratic system. Because the people who are in charge now are actually experts. So it's rather a technocratic system. Officially, we still live in a democratic system. And that's something. Hannah Arendt mentioned that already in 1953. She said, we will see the emergence of a new totalitarian system, but it will no longer be led by gang leaders such as Stalin and Hitler. It will be led by dull bureaucrats and technocrats. And that makes sense, of course, because she knew that the zeitgeist would be changing in the direction of more and more materialist view on man and the world, in which it's only logical that if you really believe that the world and society is a materialist system, that it should be led by experts That makes sense, actually. It's a logical consequence of our general, common, mechanist, materialist view on man and the world, I believe.
Yeah. So, some people say this will end when we all say no.
That's true. Because I believe if 30, even 20 or 15% says no, but in a clear and loud way, if 15% really speaks out, that it is over with the system. Yeah. Because you have this middle group who always follows the loudest voice in society. And this middle group will easily switch to the other side if it experiences the other group, the dissonant group or the dissident group, no matter how you call it, as one group. But now that is not really the case. It's a very fragmented and heterogeneous group at the moment. So I'm sure that it can end, and that the tipping point will be the moment when the dissonant voices all start to unify in one way or another. But we have to watch out, of course, that we do not form a crowd ourselves. Because if we do form if you do become a mass, then we will become as limited, and our field of attention will become as narrow as we see now in the dominant group. So there should be another solution.
Standing at the door, having to show your QR code, your friend can go in because he's vaccinated and you are not, and your friend is going in and saying, well, I'll see you later. That's a small act.
It's a small act and it's a big act. Yes. Look how we react now when people are excluded, marginalized, segregated, when there is segregation. Most people don't react. Even in Berlin.
Yeah, but that's of course because they've been told that they're the good guys. And the other one are the bad guys.
Yes.
You know, the 10% that doesn't want to be, in this case, vaccinated are the anti-socials.
Yes, of course.
So that's the mindset.
Just like then, people do believe now that there is this group who is not rational, who lacks common sense.
Your message is not all doom and gloom. You have maybe you have some positive news or a message.
Yes, I'm pessimistic and realistic in the short term. I mean, we will go through a difficult period, I think. Even if the corona narrative stops now, still we will go through a very difficult period, I think, because the tendency towards totalitarian thinking will not stop because the corona narrative stops. But in the long term, I truly believe that this crisis will lead to something good. I'm sure of that. We will find a solution, and it might be a wonderful new society that emerges after this crisis. And what do we have to do for it? I believe, well, we just mentioned it already. In the first place, we have to continue to speak out. That's always the most important thing, both for ourselves, because in this way we will feel that we exist as a human being if we continue to speak out, and we will have the feeling, I believe, that we live up to a certain ethical duty in this way. So it's very important for ourselves as a human being, but also for the other people. And because the masses in the crowd will start to be destructive, will become this monster that devours its own children if there are no dissonant voices anymore. So we just have to do it for everyone, I believe. But we also need to connect much more in the real world, I think. That's the second thing that is extremely important, I believe. Because now what we see is at the origin of the problem of totalitarianism is always this social fragmentation Robert referred to already. So this social atomization, Hannah Arendt said, the social isolation of people, which is perfectly correlated with the level of industrialization and the level of technology use. At the origin is the mechanist, materialist view of man and the world that leads to the use of technology and industrialization. That leads to the social fragmentation. And research really shows that the correlation between loneliness and the use of technology is it's very high, extremely high. So we need to connect more in the real world. Now, at this moment, we have to maybe try to establish networks of people of dissident people, vaccinated or unvaccinated, doesn't matter at all. Just connect in the real world. So speak out, connect in the real world in the future. And then the third thing I think that is extremely important, we have to stick to the principles of non-violent resistance. That's extremely important. As soon as imperialism arose and then totalitarianism, it was clear that the most efficient and the most effective way to resist was always non-violent resistance. And from a psychological point of view, you can make this clear. I won't do it now, but you can perfectly explain it, why it is like that. So that are three things, I think, for the future. If we take these three things into account, there will be a group of dissident people who do not want to buy into the narrative, who will be able to survive the situation, and we just have to wait until the system goes down as a consequence of its own self-destructiveness. That's a strategy.
Geert, you look at this more not in a political or sociological or psychological way, but as an immunologist and...
Yeah, well, I also think that we have not seen the end of the tunnel yet. Of course, this is going to end. This is not going to go on forever. And the reason why I'm saying this is that in contrast to a number of, conflicts and situations we had in the past, that here, in fact, there is a microorganism, the virus is in charge, right? And so we know that this is what's going on right now is very, very unstable, and this will be ended again by an equilibrium. But what I think, if we continue, for example, with this mass vaccination, before we reach this equilibrium, there could be a lot of harm, a lot of damage. And so for me, it's actually right now running against the clock most, because what is the kind of damage and sacrifices that we are going to need to bring before this new equilibrium, a biological equilibrium, I'm talking in biological terms, is going to be, achieved. And so therefore, I think really, in order for us as society to limit this damage, the harm, is first of all that we make people aware of what's going on. Because remember, we're always saying this is complex. This is not easy. Even for people who are desperate to understanding what's going on, it's difficult to understand. So I think we as, expert scientists, we have a moral obligation, first of all, this is the first step, to make people aware. And not spending lots and lots of time in court and, soliciting for debate and getting frustrated and say, you guys, you want to debate us, so, and in the meantime, nothing is happening. So we need to move forward very rapidly, inform people, as Matthias was saying. I mean, this almost like automatically also generates a lot of solidarity, synergy, so we are feeling that things are starting. My message is to convince the other cohort, so to say, the vaccinated, that in fact it doesn't make any sense, biologically speaking, scientifically speaking, to discriminate. We are all in the same ballpark, and it doesn't make sense to discriminate. That is also some level of conviction that we need to achieve, because that will strengthen us as human beings to fight for our health, as Matthias was saying, peaceful, but it's not like we can just relax and see what's going on and wait, right? Yeah. We have been very severely intervening in this pandemic. To get this problem solved, we need also to very aggressively engage into, a very serious effort, I would say, to change the tide.
Robert, according to you, what's the way forward?
I wish that we would be able to observe a catastrophic failure of this dominant narrative and the totalitarian practices. This is coming from having been very much a student of Washington, D.C. for decades. It's how I make my living, is I swim in these waters, continuously observing these politicians, interacting with these bureaucrats. They will recraft the narrative in a way that will enable them to maintain some shred of dignity or legitimacy. My wife and I like to joke that we will know when the pandemic is over when the bureaucrats start giving each other awards for their performance. But you laugh, but I've seen it. I'm not just saying this as a joke. I've seen it in multiple prior outbreaks, this behavior. Okay, so that will happen. I don't think that we're going to see a catastrophic failure of the system. I don't think we're going to see a collapse. Matthias talks about an event where suddenly the mass formation disseminates and people basically just walk away as if it never happened. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that this is going to be protracted. I think that the practical options that are available for those who aren't comfortable living in a world in which we're all zombies and infected by this is the creation of intentional communities. So in a sense, you have an intentional community in this finca. You have sought out an intentional community by selecting moving to this area of Spain. I think I hear, particularly in younger people in the 20 to 30, early 40 range bracket, a lot of them are, as Matthias points out, very disaffected, very disenchanted. They don't see any upside in the current system. It's gamed. It's not benefiting them. They're not winning in this environment. They can't win. It's gamed against them. And so they're opting out and they're creating intentional communities often in rural environments. I think that beyond the intentional communities, there's three things that I like to talk about and when I close out my discussions with groups. And they're very much influenced by Matthias's thinking, frankly, as well as discussions I've had with members of the Catholic Church in particular. I believe that we have to restore integrity, and we're going to have to start small, but insisting that there must be integrity within the circle that we interact with. Integrity means let's stop the lying or the noble lie or whatever, these misrepresentations, this acceptance of contriving language and behavior and finding it acceptable to craft alternative narratives in order to justify things that we're doing that are fundamentally wrong. I think most of us have a moral code. So we must maintain and restore integrity. The next thing, I think, is we have to restore dignity. This has come to me from the religious community, ecclesiastical community, the logic that there is intrinsic human dignity in all of us that has been damaged, disregarded, or destroyed. And we have to stop considering human beings as economic units or mechanized components of a mechanized system, right? I've really objected to the use of the language of economics to define humanity. I think that is intrinsically depersonalizing, and I think it destroys human dignity. It's certainly makes sense in terms of who dominates the world and how it's organized, is we're perceived as economic units from which profit and rent can be extracted. That has to stop. We have to recognize that all of us have intrinsic value in our differences, in our wonderful internal identities. We have to celebrate that, and we have to respect and restore human dignity as a core part of our society. And the third one is absolutely influenced by Matthias. We have to rebuild community, and that means all kinds, as he very appropriately points out, we have to put down the damn cell phones, and in this alternative life that is very much reflected in the metaphor of the Matrix, the movie series. I mean, we have to stop this, and we have to recreate bonds between each other to re-find our humanity. And again, that circles right back. In order to rebuild our humanity, we have to respect the dignity of each other as individuals, and we have to have integrity in those interactions, because if we don't have integrity in our interpersonal interactions, everything else goes. So it comes back to three key points: integrity, dignity, community.
The preservation of our freedom is everyone's concern. The understanding and the knowing we can burn. The knowledge we have gathered over toil and snare could bring us to a higher ground if only we would dare.
Thank you so much for making the effort, doing all the traveling to come to Spain. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. It's wonderful that you're here and that we get the chance to speak with you in person, and that you finally got the chance to meet each other.
A chance to speak out.
Yeah.
Thanks. Let's drink some wine.
Great.
consequences gather. They gather around the fire. They came this way from far today to question and inquire. Evil spreads, somebody said, round here and over there. We could react to this attack if only we would dare to love.
Alternative voices are stigmatized by a veritable ministry of truth, which is crowded with fact-checkers. Freedom of speech is curtailed by various forms of censorship and self-censorship. People's right to self-determination is infringed upon by coercive vaccination strategies, which impose heretofore unthinkable social exclusion and segregation upon society.
Please support our independent journalism and go to headwind.tv.